Imagine a courtroom silence so heavy you could hear a heartbeat. The air, usually thick with the murmur of whispers, was now held captive by an unspoken dread. In the grand King County Courthouse, sunlight, attempting to pierce through the towering glass windows, only cast long, stark streaks across the marble floors, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stillness. At the defendant's table sat David Monroe, his posture rigid, his hands clasped so tightly they were almost white. His dark eyes scanned the room, noting every detail, the almost imperceptible smirk on Prosecutor Ellis's face, the hushed, almost judgmental whispers among the spectators, the steady, unyielding gaze of the jury. Beside him, his older sister, Ava Maxwell, a quiet anchor in a rising storm. Her presence was a paradox, a calm exterior belying an inferno of protective instinct and simmering fury. David was a man in his early 30s, usually broad-shouldered and confident, but weeks of relentless accusations had stripped him bare, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. The charge of resisting arrest hung over him like a storm cloud, a dark shadow obscuring the truth. Ava reached over, her touch light but firm, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "Stay calm, David," she whispered, her voice a steady, soothing balm. "The truth always comes out. Just hold on a little longer." The heavy wooden doors creaked open, and a hush fell over the courtroom as Judge Sterling entered. His black robe billowed behind him, a dark cape of authority as he strode to his seat. He was a man in his late 60s, with a sharp nose, thinning white hair, and an air of self-importance that preceded him like a herald. His reputation for being harsh, and often biased, wasn't just a rumor. It was practically a badge of honor among his peers. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced, his deep voice echoing off the walls. Judge Sterling settled into his high-backed chair, scanning the room with a look of disdain that barely concealed his weariness. His eyes landed on Ava, and his lips curled into a faint smirk, as though he had already decided what he thought of her. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, barely audible but loud enough for the front rows to hear. Ava didn't flinch. She had dealt with men like him before. Men who saw her skin color before her credentials, who judged her appearance before her words. She had learned to let their arrogance roll off her like water on stone. Prosecutor Ellis rose to his feet with a theatrical flourish, adjusting his tie as if preparing for a grand performance. "Your Honor," he began, his voice dripping with confidence, "the evidence against a defendant is clear. This is a case of blatant disregard for law enforcement, and no amount of excuses can erase that." Ava's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. She had promised David she would let the lawyers do their job, even if every fiber of her being wanted to stand up and set the record straight. Ellis continued, his words painting David as a volatile, dangerous man who posed a threat to society. Ava's stomach churned with every exaggeration, every half-truth. When he finally finished, he sat down with a satisfied smirk, as though victory were already his. Judge Sterling turned his attention to David's defense attorney, a young, nervous man who seemed to shrink under the judge's gaze. "Well," the judge barked, "do you have anything to say, or are we just going to sit here wasting my time?" The attorney stumbled over his words, his voice barely audible. Ava felt a pang of frustration. This wasn't going to end well unless someone took control. The very air in the King County Courthouse seemed to vibrate with a familiar tension, a silent but potent reminder of how easily the scales of justice could be tipped. For many in David's community, the story unfolding was not unique. It was a devastatingly common refrain. How many times had a seemingly routine encounter spiraled into a nightmare for someone who looked like David, simply because of implicit bias, because of a narrative pre-written about who they were before they even opened their mouth? We all know these stories, perhaps from our own lives, perhaps from the news, or whispered warnings within our families. Just weeks before, on a quiet Tuesday evening, David had been pulled over. A broken taillight, Officer Jenkins had claimed, though David was certain it had been fine that morning. The officer's tone had been aggressive from the start, bypassing cordiality for a confrontational demand for license and registration. David, ever calm, had moved slowly, deliberately, to retrieve his documents. But Jenkins' patience, or perhaps his prejudice, had worn thin. "Hands where I can see them," he'd barked, his hand already on his weapon. David, startled, instinctively raised his hands, and that's when Jenkins had lunged, shoving David hard against the side of his car, then violently to the ground. The sickening thud of David's body hitting the pavement echoed in Ava's mind, a constant refrain. David, stunned and bruised, had simply asked, "Why are you doing this?" His calm question had been twisted into resisting arrest, an act of defiance in Jenkins' report. A bystander's cell phone video, grainy but undeniable, showed the truth. David, compliant, caught off guard, and then brutalized without cause. But in this courtroom, the video was just another hurdle for the defense, dismissed by the prosecutor as irrelevant. As the trial progressed, Judge Sterling's disdain for Ava became more apparent. He interrupted her lawyer's statements, dismissed objections with a wave of his hand, and even let out an audible sigh when Ava rose to testify as a character witness. "Miss Maxwell," the judge drawled, leaning back in his chair, "I hope you're not here to waste my time with sentimental nonsense. We deal in facts here, not feelings." Ava met his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "I'm here to speak the truth, Your Honor," she replied evenly. "Nothing more, nothing less." A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom, but the judge silenced them with a glare. "Very well," he said, his tone mocking. "Let's hear what you have to say." Ava stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She could feel every eye on her, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her shoulders. But she didn't falter. Years of training had taught her how to remain composed under pressure, and she wasn't about to let a pompous judge rattle her. She spoke clearly and confidently, recounting the events leading up to David's arrest and painting a picture of a man who had been unfairly targeted. But every time she tried to elaborate, Judge Sterling cut her off, his tone growing more impatient with each interruption. "Miss Maxwell," he said with a condescending chuckle, "you seem to think you're some kind of expert on law enforcement. Tell me, do you have any actual experience in the field, or are you just another armchair activist?" Ava felt a spark of anger flare in her chest, but she forced it down. This wasn't the time, not yet. As she returned to her seat, the judge's laughter echoed in her ears. She glanced at David, whose knuckles had turned white from gripping the table. "It's not over," she whispered, her voice firm. "Trust me, it's not over." Little did Judge Sterling know, the woman he had so easily dismissed was far more than she appeared. He saw an armchair activist, perhaps another black woman speaking out against perceived injustice. But Ava Maxwell carried a deeper truth, a professional authority forged in the crucible of protecting the nation's highest figures. And soon that truth would shatter his smug facade. The courtroom's energy was a living, breathing thing, thick with tension, thrumming with unspoken words. Every tick of the grand clock mounted high above the judge's bench seemed louder than the last, as if counting down to an inevitable explosion. Ava Monroe sat quietly, her composure a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil beneath her calm exterior. She had been in high-pressure situations before, situations where lives hung in the balance, but none quite like this. None where the stakes were so personal. She was biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, to expose the deep-seated prejudice lurking beneath the surface of this courtroom. The judge was so consumed by his own arrogance he couldn't see the silent storm gathering, and that, she knew, was his first, and perhaps last, fatal error. The courtroom's energy was a living, breathing thing, thick with tension, thrumming with unspoken words. Every tick of the grand clock mounted high above the judge's bench seemed louder than the last, as if counting down to an inevitable explosion. Ava Maxwell sat quietly, her composure a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil beneath her calm exterior. She had been in high-pressure situations before, moments where lives hung in the balance, but none quite like this, none where the stakes were so deeply personal. Across the room, Judge Sterling leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. His expression was one of thinly veiled contempt as he tapped his pen against the edge of his desk, a small but pointed reminder of his authority. He wasn't just dismissing Ava, he was challenging her very presence in his courtroom. "All right, Miss Maxwell," Judge Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You've had your say. Now let's get back to the real issue at hand, your brother's blatant disregard for the law." Ava's hands tightened into fists beneath the table, her knuckles pressing against her thighs. She exhaled slowly, a practiced technique she had mastered over years of managing tense situations. "Control the moment. Don't let the moment control you," she reminded herself. It was a mantra she had lived by, one that had carried her through grueling Secret Service operations. But here in this courtroom, under the judge's glare, it felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. The prosecutor, Ellis, rose to his feet again, adjusting his lapel as though preparing for an encore. His voice rang out, smooth and calculated. "Your Honor, I believe we've heard enough theatrics for one day. The evidence clearly shows that the defendant resisted arrest. Video or not, it's the officer's testimony that carries weight." Ava's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile threatening to surface. She'd reviewed that same video a dozen times. It wasn't just clear, it was damning. Officer Jenkins had escalated the situation, shoving David without provocation and drawing his weapon over what should have been a routine traffic stop. But it wasn't just about the video. It was about power, bias, and the narratives that people like Judge Sterling and Ellis spun to keep their status quo intact. This wasn't justice. It was a carefully choreographed performance, designed to minimize, to redirect, to diminish any truth that challenged their authority. Ava had seen this playbook countless times in her career, whether it was protecting a high-profile dignitary from a credible threat or uncovering a complex fraud scheme. The essence remained the same: identify the weakness, understand the opponent's strategy, and wait for the precise moment to exploit it. The judge, in his arrogance, was laying out his entire game plan, oblivious to the fact that Ava was taking notes, not out of submission, but out of strategic analysis. She leaned toward her brother, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're pushing a story that won't hold up. Stay steady, David. This isn't over." He nodded, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his unease. David had always been the strong one, the protector. Seeing him here, vulnerable and shackled by a system designed to fail him, filled Ava with a slow-burning anger she hadn't felt in years. It was a kind of anger that fueled a quiet resolve, transforming frustration into an unshakable determination. She thought of the times she'd had to remain stone-faced, observing a potential threat, waiting for the telltale sign that would allow her to act decisively. This was no different. The judge was a threat to justice, and Ava was his unwitting, silent observer. The judge cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Ava again. "Ms. Maxwell," he began, "before we move forward, I have to ask, what qualifies you to speak so passionately about law enforcement procedures? You seem quite confident for someone with no real-world experience." The question hung in the air, dripping with mockery. Spectators exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the judge's audacity. Ava tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to convey her growing irritation. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she replied evenly, "I believe my testimony speaks for itself. I witnessed the events firsthand, and I reviewed the evidence thoroughly." Judge Sterling chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that reverberated through the room. "Thoroughly, you say? And yet you fail to recognize the limitations of your perspective." But please, continue to enlighten us. After all, I'm sure your thorough review will somehow overturn years of legal precedent." The courtroom erupted into muffled laughter. The kind that Ava had grown accustomed to, the laughter of those who underestimated her. She didn't react, didn't flinch. Instead, she held the judge's gaze, unblinking and unshaken. As the afternoon wore on, the defense attorney made a feeble attempt to introduce new evidence. Statements from witnesses who had seen the arrest, documentation of Officer Jenkins' prior misconduct. But Judge Sterling waved it away with a dismissive hand. "This is irrelevant," he declared, his tone final. "We're not here to relitigate the past. We're here to address the facts of this case, not to chase ghosts." Ava's grip on the edge of the table tightened. She had seen this tactic before. Reduce, redirect, dismiss. It was a strategy designed to strip the defense of any foothold, to control the narrative before it could shift. And it was working. But Ava had one advantage Judge Sterling hadn't accounted for: her patience. She wasn't here to play his game. She was here to end it. She knew the power of a well-timed revelation, the seismic shift it could cause when an opponent was at their most complacent. This wasn't about winning a small point. It was about exposing the core rottenness of a system that allowed such arrogance and bias to flourish unchecked. Every patronizing chuckle, every dismissive wave, every veiled insult, they were all just pieces of the puzzle falling into place for Ava, confirming her strategy. She let the judge dig his own grave, deeper and deeper with every condescending word, because the higher he built his tower of arrogance, the harder it would fall when the truth finally struck. As the session drew to a close, the judge announced a brief recess. Ava rose from her seat, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor as she stepped out into the hallway. The air outside the courtroom was cooler, but it did little to ease the tension coiled in her chest. David followed close behind, his voice low and strained. "Angie, I don't know how much more of this I can take. That man, he's already made up his mind. It doesn't matter what we say." She turned to face him, her hands gripping his shoulders. "Listen to me, David, this isn't over. Not yet. You don't have to fight this alone." He searched her eyes for a moment, the weight of his fear and frustration palpable. Finally he nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly under her touch. Ava glanced back toward the courtroom doors, her mind already racing. She had held back long enough. Let Judge Sterling dig his own grave with his arrogance. When the court reconvened, it would be time to act. Time to show the judge and everyone else in that room exactly who she was. And this time, she wouldn't hold back. She would not just speak truth to power. She would unleash it. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as everyone filed back into their seats. The heavy doors groaned shut, sealing the room once again in an almost oppressive atmosphere. Ava Maxwell stepped back to the defendant's table, her heels clicking deliberately against the polished marble. Her every step seemed measured, deliberate, yet filled with purpose. David followed behind her, his head slightly bowed, but his shoulders a fraction less tense than before. Ava had said something to him during the recess, something that steadied him. Whatever it was, he clung to it like a lifeline. Judge Sterling re-entered the room shortly after, his robe billowing behind him like a cape of authority. He settled into his high-backed chair, his expression one of impatience mixed with self-satisfaction. To him, this case was a formality, another cog in the machinery of justice as he saw fit to define it. He tapped his gavel once. "Court is back in session," he announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. His eyes scanned the room, resting briefly on Ava. The faintest smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. He expected her to remain quiet, defeated even. But Ava had never been one to play to expectations. Prosecutor Ellis wasted no time launching into his closing argument. His tone was sharp, confident, and rehearsed. Each word meant to paint David as nothing more than a troublemaker, a man who resisted law enforcement and deserved the punishment the court would undoubtedly hand down. He waved dismissively toward the evidence the defense had attempted to introduce earlier, calling it a distraction and irrelevant to the facts. Ava watched him carefully, her gaze steady and unyielding. Every word he spoke felt like a brick added to the wall David was being forced to climb. But Ava wasn't worried. Not yet. She had spent years mastering the art of patience, of waiting for the right moment to act, and that moment was fast approaching. When Ellis finally sat down, Judge Sterling leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. His tone, as always, carried an edge of condescension. "Does the defense have any last-minute theatrics to present before we proceed to judgment?" Ava glanced at the defense attorney, who hesitated, his confidence clearly shaken by the judge's dismissive attitude. Before he could speak, Ava rose from her seat. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I'd like to address the court directly." The judge raised an eyebrow, a mixture of amusement and irritation crossing his face. "Miss Maxwell," he said, "I believe I've given you more than enough time to share your thoughts. Unless you have something new, something relevant to add, I suggest you sit down." Ava didn't waver. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor, the sound echoing in the suddenly silent room. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying just enough edge to command attention, "I have something very relevant to say, something I think this court needs to hear." The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly unimpressed. "Very well," he said with a sigh, gesturing for her to proceed, "but make it quick. I have other cases to hear." Ava stepped to the center of the courtroom, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on Judge Sterling. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, the collective tension thickening the air. But she didn't let it faze her. Instead, she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small black wallet, flipping it open with practiced ease. The shiny badge inside caught the light, gleaming like a beacon in the dimly lit courtroom. "My name," she began, her voice steady and deliberate, "is Special Agent Ava Maxwell, United States Secret Service." The room erupted into gasps and murmurs, a ripple of shock spreading through the crowd like wildfire. The prosecutor's jaw visibly tightened, his earlier confidence evaporating in an instant. Even the defense attorney, who had been fumbling through the case, looked up in stunned silence. Judge Sterling, however, remained frozen in his seat, his expression one of disbelief mingled with growing unease. His smirk faltered, and for the first time that day, he seemed at a loss for words. Ava didn't wait for him to respond. She continued, her voice calm but unyielding. "I have spent the last 10 years serving this country, protecting its leaders and upholding its laws, and I will not stand by while this courtroom, or any courtroom, twists justice to fit a narrative of prejudice and power." The judge finally found his voice, though it wavered slightly. "Agent Maxwell," he began, his tone no longer carrying the same air of superiority, "I fail to see how your credentials are relevant to this case." Ava's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, they're very relevant, Your Honor," she replied, "because they speak to my experience, my integrity, and my ability to recognize when someone is abusing their position of power." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring the judge to respond, but he didn't. He couldn't. Instead, the room fell into a tense silence, all eyes shifting between Ava and the man who had so arrogantly dismissed her moments ago. Ava turned to the jury, her gaze steady. "I came here today as a sister, a witness, and a believer in the justice system. But I'm also here as someone who knows what it means to stand for what's right, no matter the cost. David Monroe is not a criminal. He's a man who was unfairly targeted, just like so many others who look like him. And I will not let this court perpetuate that injustice." The tension in the room was palpable, every word Ava spoke driving it higher. Judge Sterling's face had turned an unflattering shade of red, his hands gripping the edges of his bench as though steadying himself. "You've made your point, Agent Maxwell," he said finally, his voice strained. "But this court is not the place for grandstanding." Ava stepped closer, her badge still visible, her presence commanding. "This court," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that still managed to carry across the room, "is exactly the place for truth. And it's about time someone told it." For the first time that day, Judge Sterling had nothing to say. The courtroom hung in stunned silence, as though the collective weight of Ava's words had sucked all the air out of the room. The badge she held gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, a small but unmistakable symbol of authority that now cast a long shadow over the proceedings. Ava remained where she stood, her presence commanding, her expression unyielding. At the defendant's table, David watched his sister with a mixture of awe and relief. He had always known Ava was strong, but seeing her stand against the judge's arrogance with such composure gave him a sense of hope he hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time since the trial began, he allowed himself to believe that they might actually win. Across the room, Judge Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his high-backed chair. His hands gripped the arms of the seat so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The faint smirk that had danced on his lips earlier was long gone, replaced by a thin line that betrayed his unease. For years, he had operated with impunity, wielding his gavel like a weapon to silence those he deemed unworthy of respect. But now, faced with Ava Maxwell's calm defiance, he felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping in. Fear. Ava's voice broke the silence, calm but cutting. "Your Honor," she said, her words measured and deliberate, "you asked earlier what qualifies me to speak on matters of law enforcement. Allow me to answer that question fully." She stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the judge's bench. The spectators leaned in, their curiosity palpable. Even the court stenographer paused momentarily, her fingers hovering over the keys, unable to look away. "I have spent the past decade serving as a special agent with the United States Secret Service," Ava continued, her voice steady. "In that time, I have conducted investigations, protected national leaders, and upheld the principles of justice that this country was founded on. My badge is not just a symbol of authority, it is a commitment to truth, fairness, and the rule of law." Her words echoed through the room, each syllable carrying weight. Prosecutor Ellis fidgeted in his seat, his earlier confidence now replaced by a nervous energy. He glanced toward the judge, silently willing him to regain control of the narrative. But Judge Sterling seemed frozen, his usually sharp tongue dulled by the sheer force of Ava's presence. Ava turned her attention to the jury, her gaze sweeping across their faces. "You've been asked to make a judgment today," she said, her tone softening but losing none of its strength. "But how can we expect justice to be served when the scales are tipped before the trial even begins? My brother David has been painted as a criminal, not because of his actions, but because of the color of his skin. And that bias didn't start with the arresting officer. It permeates every level of this system, including this courtroom." A murmur rippled through the spectators, the weight of her words sinking in. One of the jurors, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She glanced toward the judge, then back at Ava, as though reevaluating everything she had heard so far. Judge Sterling cleared his throat, attempting to reassert control. "Ms. Maxwell," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Agent Maxwell," Ava corrected him, her tone razor-sharp. The correction landed like a slap, silencing him instantly. "And with all due respect, Your Honor, I'm not finished." The judge's mouth opened, then closed again. He leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of anger and humiliation. For the first time in his long career, he was powerless to dictate the flow of his own courtroom. Ava returned to the defendant's table, placing her badge carefully on the wooden surface. It sat there, a silent reminder of her authority, glinting in the light as if daring anyone to challenge it. She placed her hands flat on the table and leaned forward, addressing the entire room. "The evidence is clear," she said, her voice steady. "The video shows David being pushed to the ground without cause. Witnesses have testified to the officer's aggressive behavior, yet this court has chosen to dismiss those facts, to ignore the truth in favor of a narrative that fits a deeply ingrained bias." She straightened, letting her words sink in before continuing. "But I will not allow my brother, or anyone else, to be railroaded by a system that values power over justice. Not today, not ever." The room erupted into hushed whispers, the tension reaching a boiling point. Ava stepped back, her posture calm but firm, and returned to her seat beside David. He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, pride. Judge Sterling sat motionless for a moment, his face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual authority. "Agent Maxwell," he said, each word carefully measured, "while your credentials are impressive, they do not grant you the right to undermine this court." And Ava met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm not here to undermine this court, Your Honor," she said. "I'm here to ensure that justice is served. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps it's worth asking yourself, why?" The judge's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening. He glanced toward the prosecutor, who was now frantically flipping through his notes, searching for a way to regain the upper hand. But there was nothing he could say, nothing he could do to undo the shift in power that Ava had created. The courtroom sat in tense silence, the air thick with anticipation. Everyone in the room knew that something monumental had just occurred, though the full weight of it had yet to settle. Judge Sterling adjusted his robe, his movements stiff and mechanical. "This court will take a recess," he announced, his voice lacking its usual force. "We will reconvene shortly." He banged his gavel and rose from his seat, his robe billowing behind him as he exited the room. But the sound of the gavel, meant to signify authority, felt hollow, like the last gasp of a man who had lost control of his own kingdom. Ava watched him go, her expression unreadable. She turned to David and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This isn't over," she said quietly, "not by a long shot." And as the doors closed behind the judge, Ava knew that the battle was far from finished. But for the first time the tide had turned, and justice felt just within reach.